Imagine reading curated opinion pieces that aim to help us better understand policy and politics from the people closest to it, or sometimes people who want to be far from it. We offer political insights without the limit of column inches. Introducing Quotes by Air Quotes Media, creators of the Herle Burly and Curse of Politics podcasts, where we bring politics from the inside out. And now with Quotes, you can read from contributors like Jim Coyle, Jim Stanford, and Kathleen Wynne, with more to come. Read Quotes at airquotesmedia.com/quotes.
Greetings, you curious, you courageous Herle Burlyites. We have a very timely and, as it played itself out these last few weeks, controversial topic to discuss on the pod today. Our guests are journalists Jessica Smith-Cross and Charlie Pinkerton, until recently employed at Queen's Park Briefing, which is now owned by one of the two former proprietors of the Toronto Star, Paul Rivett. Ms. Smith-Cross as an editor, Mr. Pinkerton as a reporter and editor. They had the story of Premier Ford's daughter's fundraising Stag and Doe party, attended by developers eyeing the Greenbelt, all ready to go for QP briefing. A story of the Premier's potential conflict of interest until the new ownership at the publication intervened and killed it. That story was eventually published and followed up on in the Star and other media outlets. The Star is owned by Mr. Rivett's former partner at TorStar, Jordan Bithoff. Ms. Smith-Cross and Mr. Pinkerton both resigned from QP briefing and have now launched TheTrillium.ca covering Queen's Park. We have a great piece by Jim Coyle about all this over at airquotesmedia.com called Conflict, Powerful Men Not Getting Basic Principles. In it, Jim writes, some journalism organizations should strike a reporting award in the names of Jessica Smith-Cross and Charlie Pinkerton. Their integrity and courage marked a shining moment in the news biz in Ontario. So we're going to dive deeply today into both the substance of this story and in the machinations around it being printed. Jessica, Charlie, welcome to the Herle Burly today. Great to have you.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks.
So let's start with you, Jessica. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into journalism.
Oh, boy. I'm a journalist. I graduated from journalism school in 2009.
Which one?
UBC.
Okay.
Yeah. Went straight to an unpaid internship, as one does. Did some reporting at Six Nations for the Turtle Island News. Did the local journalism thing, local CTV, local Metro newspapers. Found my way to Queen's Park nearly a decade later. Did that since 2016. And I was the editor-in-chief of both Queen's Park Briefing and iPolitics when this sort of thing happened.
Right. What made you want to become a journalist?
I liked it. I started studying creative writing because I wanted to, write an amazing novel, but then I started working at the campus paper and just found it thrilling. Being able to ask people whatever you want, getting involved in the drama. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Charlie, what was your path?
Well, I was a very naive high school student who didn't really know what he wanted to do in Kingston, Ontario, where I grew up. So I went to my guidance counselor and asked, well, what should I do? I'm going to graduate soon. I got to get off to university. I was asked in return, well, what do you like? And I said, I like sports. And then I was told, well, we see your capabilities here in various high school sports, and you're clearly not good enough to do that for a living. So how would you feel about writing about sports? So I said, sure. So that led me to apply to Carleton Journalism School. I got in there. It was within, a year or two there where I quickly realized that there was maybe 5 or so positions in sports journalism in this country where you can earn a living that I would feel comfortable earning. So yeah, still, I think I worked pretty hard throughout school, through university, that is, perhaps not so much throughout high school. And anyways, yeah, that kind of led me to a point where after a internship with the London Free Press, right after I graduated, I returned to Ottawa to run a local sports newspaper there. And in the midst of doing that, crossed paths with one of my professors, Chris Waddell, who's a great guy and who I admired very much. And it was at a Carleton football game where he asked me if I was looking for work. And through that, he put me in touch with James Baxter, who was one of the founders and who ran iPolitics. And I went and got brunch, I think, with James. And James asked me if I had any interest in doing political reporting. I'm sure I gave him a very horrible impression because I had no idea about anything that he was asking me about. Nevertheless, he invited me to kind of start working for a part of the business that did kind of journalist adjacent work. And I did that for a little bit, and then eventually became a reporter with iPolitics and spent a number of years, about 3.5, on the Hill with them before moving over to Queen's Park and eventually working for QP Briefing within the same umbrella.
Two follow-ups for you, Charlie. What is journalist adjacent work?
Yeah, I guess to explain that, so iPolitics had a service called iPolitics Intel, and so as I guess understood best, various ministers' offices and kind of like interest groups would pay iPolitics Intel to cover things like parliamentary committees, and so I say journalist adjacent because I'd be going to these committees and writing 7 to 9 page reports on what was happening there. And, it wasn't, it wasn't journalism, but it was
adjacent,
similar in work. Yeah. Adjacent. Yeah. There we go.
Second follow-up question. Did you have Ellie Elboim as a professor at Carleton?
No, that's actually not a name that I recognize.
No, that's too bad. Too bad. He would have equipped you well for what you've just gone through. And anyway, Jessica, did you want to say something? I feel like I cut you off.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, it's funny for me to hear how Charlie kind of backed into doing politics because he's built for political reporting. Like, it's just in his very nature, at least as he is today.
Yeah.
So kind.
Well, I assume, we'll get into this later, I assume that in the sports reporting business, there's a lot of stories that don't get reported. But I think never been sure that the standards are the same in sports as they are in politics for what has to get covered. In any event, so what kind of publication is QP Briefing? What is it supposed to do?
Today or before?
Before, when you worked there, what did you think it was?
So QP Briefing is usually heavily paywalled. So a hard paywall, you can't read it unless you subscribe. The subscription fees were more than the casual reader would want to pay. At an audience of folks who were generally quite involved with Ontario politics and policy, and we'd be doing stories that were generally kind of wonky, more in-depth than you might get from The Wire or the broadsheets or whatever, trying to give a little bit of the extra inside baseball to make all of that worthwhile, which I loved because getting deep into policy details or deep into political drama is actually a lot of fun. And every so often from time to time, when there was a story that had a broad appeal, we'd open the paywalls and let it out. Right before all of this happened, it was the ownership had changed. It had been with the Toronto Star. It went over to iPolitics. The finalization of that deal was happening when this happened.
Right. And who was the audience, as near as you can tell?
People who care a lot about Queen's Park, people who have business with Queen's Park, unions, associations, lawyers, lobbyists, MPs themselves, civil servants. Inside.
Well, Charlie, I didn't really think of it, and please don't be insulted, just using this as a launchpad. I didn't really think of it as a place that broke stories. I mean, there's a number of these newsletters. Yours is among the most prominent, but there are other daily sort of reports on Parliament or Queen's Park or various other capitals. And normally they're full of, here's who's lobbying who on what, here's what who said yesterday, etc., but not investigative journalism. Am I wrong about that? Was this a unique circumstance or was this normal for QP Briefing?
I guess I'd say this very situation probably represented the extreme. In terms of stories that we've broken, there were stories in the last year or so. If we think about the member of the Ottawa Police Services Board who attended the convoy protests, we think about the Solicitor General's spokesperson who donated to the Freedom Convoy. Trying to think of other stories we've had. We had a good scoop on the housing bills during the fall. So, these things are there, but I think behind that paywall that Jess talked about, it was very much kind of sheltered. But a lot of the work that we were doing was very niche and insidery.
Right. So just to stick with the paper for a second, because I do want to get into the story, but I want to understand. I mean, to me, the story and the process are interlinked. So, Jessica, what was at the time of this incident, what was the ownership structure that you were working under, and what were the reporting relationships?
Okay, so Queen's Park Briefing was owned by the Toronto Star, but there was like an agreement with the folks at iPolitics, where I was an iPolitics employee, so was Charlie. We were reporting for Queen's Park Briefing, but also our stories would come out in iPolitics as well.
The Toronto Star had at some point bought iPolitics from James Baxter. Is this what I'm to understand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And then sold half of it to another group. And then during the great TorStar divorce, Paul Rivett was taking the Star's half and joining it up with iPolitics to have it sort of fully on the iPolitics side. And that was finalized at exactly the same time as this happened, which was added layers of complexity to the whole drama.
So who did you report to?
Oh, I reported to the publisher, Laura Pinnell.
Okay. What's the publisher's role in this kind of an organization?
So the publisher is basically in charge. She oversees all sides of things, both the editorial and sort of the business side of things. I am supposed to have final say on what happens on the editorial side, but it's completely normal for me to work with her on that.
Okay. When
this happened, it was the owner's involvement that became an issue.
So, the Toronto Star partnership broke up as we read about it because Rivett didn't really believe in journalism. Or certainly didn't think that journalism as it was practiced by the Toronto Star was a money-making proposition. And he was a business person who wanted to make money. So when he decided to exit the Star, but wanted to take over iPolitics and QP Briefing, Charlie, did that send any signals to you that maybe something was going to be different?
Well, you're going to say shivers down my spine, but no, actually, I think when we learned about where we as a company fit in the split up, I had been through at that point, that would have represented, I think, my fourth ownership iteration while working for iPolitics. There were the Baxter days, the publicly traded TorStar days, and the Beethoven and Rivett ownership. I guess it would have been fifth. And then there was, the second ownership group that bought in. And then there was this, kind of new era, which we learned about, I think, in, close to the end of last year. And I had thought that things had been running pretty well with our company over the last, 6 months, year or so, and that things were, on the up and up, just in terms of resources and, doing the work that we were proud of and thought was valuable and whatnot. So, I had followed that TVO panel of where Jordan Beethoven and Paul Rivett were both a part of. Like many others in the industry, I thought it was rather wild, some of what they were disclosing with the company and some of their thoughts about journalism. But I guess just to me, because of what I'd been through with the company before that, it didn't really spook me or anything like that. I just saw it as, okay, well, here's kind of what's happening now, and didn't really have any major reservations other than knowing that there might be some changes in terms of staffing, resources, that sort of thing.
The fish that saved Pittsburgh. Okay, maybe that's an arcane reference for most of you Herle Burlyites, But I am a child of the 70s, and this movie is basically 1979 stuffed into a time capsule. Disco, basketball, Dr. J, Julius Erving, striped tube socks, and Stockard Channing sporting a hellacious perm. And in case you're wondering, yes, it is relevant to today's story from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, the cow that saved Eden Valley. We've been talking here about TELUS's deep cultural commitment to network resilience and reliability. Maybe never tested as severely as during its emergency response measures at the height of COVID-19. Eden Valley, Alberta, is known for its sweeping terrain of hills and valleys. Stunning, yes, but also a natural interruption for cell signals. And home to about 700 members of the Bear Spa First Nation. When COVID hit, there was an outbreak at a nearby meatpacking plant. 18 Bear Spa members tested positive. Immediate, reliable communication with Alberta Public Health became critical, as the community could not afford to be cut off from desperately needed resources. Literally a matter of life and death. The province reached out to TELUS for help. Quick lateral thinking by the TELUS team saw them deploy what they call a COW, an acronym for Cell Site on Wheels, typically used for far less vital one-offs like parades or festivals when additional network capacity is needed. Community leaders were quick to take action, tracing contacts to limit the spread of the virus. Those who were infected went into isolation, and supports were put in place for their families as they recovered. Key to it all was that immediate connectivity between residents, their families, and public health officials. This is just one resilience and reliability story among many of how TELUS activates during emergency conditions, Herle Burlyites. Cutting-edge technology, mobilized by people going above and beyond to keep us connected when the stakes are at their highest. Okay, so let's move to this story itself. Charlie, you were the lead reporter on it?
That's correct.
Okay. How long had you been working on it?
Yeah, so in a serious way, really since the end of last year. The first time I had heard about this was actually the day after the Stag and Doe happened. So the Stag and Doe was on August 11th. August 12th was that was the day when the premier had a press conference where he swallowed a bee, which most people will remember. And that's the only reason why really that's probably a relevant, timestamp in this process. But it was while I was at that, kind of everyday media availability that I first, learned or was tipped off to hearing that there was some sort of, at the time it was, described to me, developers party at the premier's house the night before. I thought that was kind of interesting, but didn't really give it much thought. Then over the fall, some of the policy moves by the government, there was a strong mayor's bill, there was a rather large housing bill, and there was the Greenbelt land swap as well. I think it was shortly after the Greenbelt land swap that, that kind of jogged my memory. And I started thinking back to the summer and this, again, what I had heard of as a developers party at the premier's house. I was like, oh, I should really look into that in a more serious way. And so in late November and December, we got back a pair of Freedom of Information requests, one of which was the premier's calendars for the months after the election. We file these things pretty regularly, so that was just filed out of interest of the calendars themselves. And so what those calendars showed, these are calendars kept by the Cabinet Office. They showed that on August 11th, I believe there was 2 redacted items for personal reasons. And then there was, basically the entirety of the day was under what was listed as a block. And so it's been told to me since by those who specialize in freedom of information requests in the Cabinet Office that a block is basically like a way that staff block out schedules for commitments kept off of the official calendar. So that kind of, gave me a bit more confidence into looking into it as on August 11th as something that, might have happened. We then filed a, very carefully targeted freedom of information request to the Cabinet Office, trying to pin down the premier's, the staff who would be talking about his whereabouts and his activities on any given day, any of their communications and any information that the cabinet office might have pertaining to those things, the premier's whereabouts and his activities on August 11th. And it was the response to that, which was that there was no records found, that really sort of, at least in my mind, gave me the confidence to, talk with Jess and have the rest of our team get on board with me spending the significant amount of time that was needed to be spent to figure this out through the month of January.
So, Jessica, Charlie comes to you with this story. What did you think, putting on your editor's hat, what did you think was important about the story and necessary for it to run?
At this point, the premier having a party with developers at his house at this particular point in time was newsworthy on its own. The question of his relationship with developers has been a live one for his entire political career. And right now, before all of the Greenbelt, in the lead up to the Greenbelt announcement and all of the speculation about who knew what when, and if some developers may have been given a heads up that some land was about to be opened up, maybe they should buy in. This was a huge ongoing controversy at Queen's Park. So nailing that down would be huge. And that's even before Charlie learned that this thing was apparently a pay-to-play event, which adds a whole other level, as I know you know.
Right. What is the criteria you assess when you're going to write something about a politician's personal life? This was raised in the Tory resignation as well. What's the threshold at which something that somebody does personally becomes news?
I don't really give a damn about his personal life. It wasn't about that. It's about the public side of things. It's about the developers who have interest in government business. It's about the premier. It's not about his daughter or the wedding. Those happen to be the setting for it, but we don't care about the details of that or her life in any way. It's as minimal as possible in the story.
Charlie, the premier says it's personal and intrusive. What do you say?
I think that's a very difficult line to draw when you're the premier of the province, and when these events, as we know, between the two of them, were attended by people who are interested in government business, or in some cases are employed by the government. I think at that point, it's no longer a personal event or event.
So if he had not announced plans to develop the Greenbelt, I'm just pushing around this. If he had not announced plans to develop the Greenbelt, would this still have been a news story worth publishing?
If the pay-to-play aspect, absolutely. Lobbyists on any subject, people with interest in government appointments paying to have admission to the premier's home where he's there, would still be Greenbelt aside.
You agree, Charlie?
Yeah, I do agree. And there was actually, embarrassingly so, it was only pretty late in the reporting process that I realized that one of the developers who attended the wedding actually was one of the developers who is benefiting from the Greenbelt land swap. So, our suspicion and the fact that what really kind of tipped us off and led us to spend the amount of time that we spent on this story was the Greenbelt land swap. But as I began looking into this and investigating and finding out some of the names of the people who were in fact there was a point where we weren't, we had not confirmed that anyone benefiting from the Greenbelt land swap was at the wedding or the Stag and Doe. And because of what Jess just mentioned, this sort of past history of the premier's closeness with developers, and really the government's position towards that industry, that it was still relevant from a reporting standpoint.
All right. So I'm about to do something that might seem a bit jarring to those of you who've listened to my smooth, eloquent delivery since the Herle Burly first burst into the sky of Canadian podcasting 6 years ago, forever improving our political discourse. I'm going to use a cliche. Cliches can be hackneyed, yes, but some make you think, like the following: fast, good, and cheap. Pick two. In other words, you can have fast and good, fast and cheap and good, good and fast, but you can never have fast and good and cheap. I would pause here and let you reflect on that, but we have to move things along here. Anyway, it's sort of an economic law of nature. It applies to all, including our sponsor, CN. And I was thinking about it this morning when I saw a new report on rail cargo rates. Yes, I read things like that. The report, published by a leading independent consulting firm, concluded that Canadian rates are the lowest among the major free market economies it studied, including the United States. The price of shipping cargo in Canada has grown far less quickly over the past 33 years than the price south of our border. As a result, shipping in Canada is on average 11% cheaper. And Canada's grain shippers, benefiting from economies of scale, scored even better prices, paying nearly 30% less than the average Canadian rate. So, relatively cheap service, and CN believes very good service, which leaves fast. Could it be faster? Well, the fact is the supply chain, elevators, trains, export terminals, truck fleets have a capacity. Only so much can move at once. To deploy another cliche, you can't stuff 10 pounds of oats into a 5-pound bag. Oats? Did I say oats? Well, whatever. My point is that moving cargo faster means laying more track, buying more trains, expanding truck fleets, and building more seaport terminals. All of which takes money. Like a lot of money. And time. Which brings us back to the fundamental choice. Fast, good, cheap. Like I said, pick two. I'm going to ask you what is perhaps an unfair question. But I have worked with politicians in my life who had to be told that people that had previously been their friends and acquaintances, they couldn't see in certain circumstances anymore, and they would not really understand that, or sometimes their spouses would not understand that, not understand why a longtime friendship couldn't continue in the same manner in which it had existed before. You've had the opportunity to look in the whites of the Premier's eyes as he talks about this. Do you think that he genuinely does not see it as a conflict of interest, or do you think he does and he's just blustering his way through it?
My personal read on how he sees this is that he should be allowed to do what he wants with whomever he wants, and nobody can influence Doug for it. I think when he says that, he means it. But I think that may also be beside the point from our point of view.
Understand that. But you think that's what he thinks, that he's not done anything wrong?
Really hard to read his mind. But I do think there is a sense that I should be allowed to do this. Mm-hmm.
Charlie, what's your take? You've talked to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I wouldn't dare try to enter the mind of the Premier of this province. But you know,
there's space.
I guess I would say, yeah. I guess I would say I think I agree with Jessica's, sort of read of the situation, and whether it's his belief that nothing is wrong, or it's those who are around him who encourage him to believe that nothing is wrong, with these sort of relationships continuing in this way. I think it's somewhere in between those.
Right. But it's so brazen. I mean, this story completely, I thought, was, the nail in the coffin of the Greenbelt policy. I mean, it's just astonishing that a person would think that they could be doing what he did with the Stag and Doe with people that are going to benefit substantially from a government policy.
It's not just the Greenbelt either. It's worth noting that the sort of pro-development moves from the Ford government are more than just the Greenbelt. They're individual MZOs across the province. When we say the pro-development thing existed before the Greenbelt, and it will continue afterwards. And so it doesn't matter necessarily if a developer A was there. If they're not involved in the Greenbelt, they may have had an MZO or something else. And the pro-development mindset of the Premier in this government is going to survive this scandal one way or the other. It's who they are. And so I don't think it's a nail in the coffin of the Greenbelt or any other pro-development moves for them.
Right. Okay. So let's come back to the process. So So you've got this story, which we've now discussed why it was important, what the implications of it are, and you're going to run this story. Do you how does Rivett find out?
There's some things I don't know, but I can take you through the process of we're going to run this story. So first, you get all the ducks in the row. Charlie's done the FOI requests. He's talking to dozens of people about who was there, what has he heard, what as much as we can learn about the thing. From there, it's time to give the Premier's office a chance to comment, and the developers who are mentioned as well. So Charlie does the due diligence. He puts an exhaustive list of questions together to give them to the Premier's office, to send them to the developers. He's got a draft of the story sort of ready to go. In case they get back to us pretty quickly, that goes to a lawyer, and we have a lawyer read it to see how solid it is, to point anything out that we should do should somebody get pissed off and decide they might want to sue. The lawyer goes through it, has no concerns, bases covered. We wait for the Premier's office to get back to us. Charlie has probably more to say about this, but at this point, the Premier's office goes to the Integrity Commissioner with information that Charlie has asked about to get the event retroactively cleared. In doing so, takes part of the story that was more based on sources, the Stag and Doe part of stuff, and really does verify that Charlie was on the mark with it. So we not only get the Premier's defense of why he did what he did and what is happening here, and that it was 100,000% cleared by the Integrity Commissioner, we also get some of the facts confirmed. At that point, the story is rewritten and re-lawyered. The publisher is in on that conversation. We're good to go. It was only after that I got a call from the publisher saying that the owners had read it and would not allow it to be published in its current form. And that's when things started to go poorly.
What reason were you given?
That was actually a little hard to get at the beginning. Eventually, I got sort of a phone call with her outlining some concerns about the overall tone. It's a really strange conversation, and some particular details. So, for instance, she's like, "Why do we have to include these personal details?" What personal details? We, didn't even mention the husband's name. There's nothing about the wedding itself. This is all public interest stuff. Oh well, you have information here about the developer who has a public appointment, and you say how much he makes sitting on those boards and stuff like that. Like, that's not personal information. That's by definition public information. Those are public dollars. You mentioned that a developer's family was there who are involved in the development industry in their own right. It was alarming.
Right.
Tensions got high. I told her straight up that the owners can't interfere like this. From the first time she said they'd read it and they wouldn't allow it to be published, I told her that I would probably have to quit if this was going to happen. She perceived that as a threat. I tried to explain that that's an ethical line. Charlie, you can speak for yourself, had the same line, and so did the other two reporters in the office.
Charlie, let me read you something. This feels like a bullet aimed right at you. This is from the Toronto Star. The story in question did not meet the publication's standards, publisher Laura Pennell told the Star on Thursday. Editorial staff were provided an opportunity to edit and amend the story to have it meet the strong ethical and professional standards we require. What does that mean?
Good question. I guess I would just say it seems to have met the standards of pretty much every other publication that covers Ontario politics since, including QP Briefing, which has since published information about this very story. So, I guess not really quite sure what that refers to, since this is a story that in similar...
You were given no specifics? You were given no specifics about what was wrong with your story?
Well, the same specifics that Jess was told were relayed to me. I think another one that Jess didn't mention was we were told that, or I guess another gripe was the length. So in its original form, the length of the story was about 3,000 words, probably about half and half of, original reporting to do with the Stag and Doe and the wedding. some of the FOI stuff I talked about, and then the other half was a lot of this background information on who these developers were, and the appointments. Some of them hold the minister's zoning orders. Some of them have received, and so actually with that particular gripe. We were willing to split the story in half and, publish it in two pieces. First being original reporting, the second being, essentially a story, essentially an explainer saying, here's who these developers are. We did do that. This was in the final day of our, attempts to get this out with QP briefing. I'd asked for those versions to be lawyered. And, that did not happen either.
So what's wrong with an owner of a publication deciding what's going to be in the publication?
It really, really harms our credibility. If we're just reporting what they want to see, we just can't be trusted to do our jobs. I mean, on a personal level, it feels like a personal insult. This is what we do for a living. For you to tell me that this developer's board appointments are not news, for some reason we shouldn't be sharing this to the public. It hurts, but also it just destroys our credibility. When you're trying to get somebody to trust you, they need to know that when you say like, this is a story, it's newsworthy, I'm going to pursue it, trust me with your story, it's not going to get spiked by the person who owns the thing and has myriad other business interests. Like, it's just not okay.
Well, wait. So I'm just a layperson. I never took a journalism course. Mm-hmm. But I know that when Conrad Black owns newspapers, those newspapers skew to the right of the political spectrum. And I know that when the Atkinson Foundation owns a newspaper, owns the Toronto Star, it skews to the left of politics. So how is that different than what we're talking about here, which is an owner exerting influence over the direction of the coverage?
I think there's a big difference between having journalists and editors and editorial board writers who gravitate to one side or the other, feeling naturally at home at a publication of their choice. At all of those papers that you mentioned, when the time comes, they're going to write a negative story about somebody on their side or who's more ideologically aligned with them. I know the public doesn't always recognize that, but you'll see Star reporters going after Liberals and NDP or whoever you think they might be holding the bag for. The same goes for conservative-leaning outlets. It's a big difference between this sort of natural split and I'm going to kill a story that's in the public interest.
Charlie, had anybody before ever tried to influence your stories from ownership?
No. This was the first time that this has happened. And, had there been a previous time, I think the evidence of the result would suggest that the first time would be the last time.
Right.
But, that's what happened.
Is it possible that Rivett has a different idea of what the publication ought to be? Like, he's obviously not interested in journalism. We learned that through the Toronto Star escapade. So maybe he just, I'm curious about why he even wanted iPolitics and QP briefing and wondering if he just sees them as a trade publication rather than a newspaper.
He can go ahead and do that now if that's what he wants. I don't know because I haven't heard directly from him about it.
Right.
And I should say, I've never spoken to Paul Rivett one-on-one. I believe I tried to call him at one point during this whole unfolding. It wasn't actually, though, until after we had quit and after this all unfolded that it was reported elsewhere that it was apparently Paul Rivett who made this call. But while this was unfolding, didn't hear from either of the owners. And so, all that I was aware of was the fact that the owners were the ones who were, requiring changes if the story were to publish at all.
Hey, so you quit. Amazing act of courage and principle because, it's not exactly a terrific job market for journalists. So to quit a job is a significant statement. And what happened next? Because somehow the story ended up in the Toronto Star with your byline on it, Charlie?
Mm. Well, I appreciate you saying all that, David, but it certainly didn't feel like that at the time. From when Jessica relayed to me that this interference from the ownership was happening, and the time that I quit was 26 and a half or 27 and a half hours, I believe. I guess there wasn't much time for planning of what to do, but, you know, why I say it really didn't feel like that at the time was because, you know, when Jess first brought to my attention that this was happening, and she told me first that she was likely going to quit over this, I told her, well, you know, I'll be quitting too then if this is what's going to be happening. And our other reporters who were working at the time, they followed suit. And so, you know, I think it was, you know, that gave me the confidence at least to recognize that what we were doing is right. And from a completely self-interested standpoint, if we hadn't have quit and this were ever to be found out, then I don't think I or any of us would be employable as journalists ever again. And so, you know, from that perspective, yes, it's a tough job market, and yes, having a job is a good thing, but it would be career suicide not to do what we were doing, which ultimately I believe was the right and principled thing to do. So when I quit, I was aware at the time that, you know, global was sort of on our tails here. And so I sort of immediately began to explore how else that I could report this story. Given what happened with us, with myself quitting and our colleagues, before they had the chance to quit, being fired, and with Jessica quitting as well, there's obviously a lot of kind of attention and confusion of what was going on with our publication. It was just very odd, obviously. And so due to that, I heard from a lot of people, including a lot of different publications, interested in, you know, the story that was centered to this saga. And so, you know, within maybe, I don't know, well, by the next day, I had spoken to editors or reporters at different publications who were interested in picking up the story. Ultimately decided to go with the Star. You know, they had done a lot of, like, it was them with the Narwhal who did really great reporting on some of the developers who stood to benefit from the Greenbelt land swap. You know, I know they have a very wide reach, of course. They have very capable journalists. And so that seemed like a rather good fit. And so I started working with them the next day.
Interesting. Cool. All right, Jessica, tell me about the Trillium. So very quickly bounce back with a new project with some new backing. Tell me about it.
Yeah, that was wild. So my DMs on Twitter are open, and the day after we quit, I got one from the CEO of Village Media, Jeff LG. I hope I'm saying that right. Who just wanted to chat. He'd been planning to hire a Queen's Park reporter. Village has a chain of like 20, I think it's 21 local news
small
sites.
town papers. Barry something, the blah blah, right?
Yeah, sort of.
Elliott Lake. Yeah.
What they've done is when there's been a small town newspaper in trouble, like close up, they'll start up a site and they'll pick up some of the reporters who work there to keep local news happening in the town. So they've got the local news stories, cop releases, obituaries, buy and sell, like the functions that a small town paper would do have been just moved online, and they do it on their easily replicable online website platform because all this sort of exists. When this happened, and they were already interested in doing something at Queen's Park, they were able to move very quickly and say, we're going to start up a Queen's Park outlet. So we did. He convinced us all to come on board. So that's all 5 reporters. So we had Charlie and I, Jack and Aiden, who were working, and include Anne Snay, who was on maternity leave when she was laid off. So we've all joined up to start the Trillium, and we're back in Queen's Park doing what we do, and it's fantastic.
It's a crowded space, though, right? Is there still Queen's Park Briefing, and there is another competitor as well, is there not?
Yeah, there's a couple. There are, I guess, 4 online Queen's Park outlets, plus a couple of environmentally focused outlets with Queen's Park bureaus, plus the broadsheets and the Wire and the CBC and all,
Yeah. I'm just wondering if there's more people working for these online newsletters now covering Queen's Park than there is covering Queen's Park at newspapers in Ontario, because there aren't many.
I would like to distinguish us from this sort of sole proprietor model of newsletter writing, right? We have a bureau of now 5 people reporting news. We do break scoops. We can break scoops. We can have the impact that you can with that kind of journalist power more than just somebody who's sitting writing a newsletter every day.
Right. And so what's the vision for this? To be what you had been doing at Queen's Park Briefing, or something different?
The thing where you're building the thing while you're running with it, while it's operating, there's a bit of that going on. But the idea is that we're doing both the kind of insider coverage that we did at Queen's Park Briefing, but also reporting for the local outlets across the province, which is actually the side of it that really excites me.
Okay. So just take a step back from the story itself and the events and talk about a few things philosophically. I mean, I think people who work in journalism are in an interesting place because the economics of the business are so terrible now, and publications are under such financial stress now. I'm old enough to know when people like you would have been the Queen's Park bureau chief for one of the major papers, and then you'd have been the Ottawa bureau chief for one of the major papers, and then you'd have been the Washington bureau chief, and then you'd have gotten a column, and then you'd have retired. And that would have been your career. And you'd have never thought about losing your job the whole time. And now you actually have to wonder whether this business will even outlast you. And so as journalists, when you're working in that environment where the economics and commercial success is ever present in your life, how do you balance the needs for commercial viability of news organizations and the need to truthfully and accurately report the news? Is there a conflict there, and how do you balance it?
My joke answer is you just compartmentalize and you leave the worry about the future to somebody else and do what you need to do. And that's certainly part of it. My job at iPolitics was a bit more, you have to think about both. Actually, part of the work that I enjoyed was working with the publisher, who I really liked, by the way, despite all this, on setting up newsletters and beat reporting that work for both sides of the publication. We wanted iPolitics to be a success. So we were talking about ways to have really strong public interest reporting married into a business model that works. And I liked that part of it, and it was promising.
Charlie?
Yeah, I think, the desire for a product that is at its core information is not something that is going to go away. And in terms of what Jess mentioned, in terms of specific beat reporting and covering things that otherwise wouldn't be covered, I don't think that that's going to be a market that dries up. And so, David, you had said, it's a bit of a crowded space at Queen's Park. There's so much happening on a daily basis. I try to keep up with it. I cannot. And so I think that, it's just not something that's going to go away. The fact that what various levels of government are doing, obviously, really local reporting has especially been impacted over the last couple of decades, particularly within my lifetime. My grandparents and parents very much like to vent about how the Kingston Wig standard is not what it used to be. I think it's in the industry in this country.
Turns out that none of the reporters were ever important. It was the classified ads that were important.
Well, the thing is where I'm going with this is that I like to think and I like to hope that we've gotten to a point where the industry is turning a corner and finally realizing after several decades of pretty much across the sector mismanagement of business operations, that there are still ways to make money here. I'm hopeful that the company we now work for, with the business model that they have and that has shown to allow them to grow within the last couple of decades to the size that they are, can be an example of that. And so, it's something that I think the industry really needs to figure out as a whole, but also individually, which I think it is doing. And I really wouldn't have said around that time when I was in, university and having my sort of crises of why the hell did I get into this?
So, we're talking about influence, subtle, sometimes direct, other times. One of the things that's topical in this industry, and I'd like to get your takes on it, is are you noticing or do you worry about any reporting impact, any impact on reporting of the federal government from the federal subsidy to news organizations?
Do you want to say about compartmentalizing things? I don't see any reporter holding back on the Trudeau Liberals at all. I don't know of any. I think they're going after the interference story pretty hard. I think, from my point of view, that the perception that journalists are influenced by this stuff is bad. It's real. The actual influence, I don't see it. And I recognize that we're talking a lot today about a story about a premier who doesn't feel influence, but the perception of influence is the problem. So perhaps you might call me a hypocrite, but I don't feel the influence. I don't see the influence, but I understand that the perception is a problem.
Do you have a different take on that, Charlie?
No, I think that I personally see a lot of issues with the federal subsidy because of the perception that we're talking about right now. It creates a perception of influence, but all the journalists that I know who work for legitimate publications, whether they're online like ours, or whether they're legacy news publications, just like Jess said, they're not holding back. But I do find it unfortunate that this is sort of the mechanism that the federal government has chosen to go with to support this industry, because no doubt it creates a perception.
Right. Okay. My last question is about you two as people, just to get an insight into your mindset. Because I listen, I'm just obsessed with the news industry and its decline and what's happening to sources of news and the shrinkage of newsrooms and coverage. And I read long form articles like one about the Calgary Herald and what happened to it over time, etc. So you're in the business and you're young. What is the mindset of a young journalist? Like, is it your assumption that you will do this in one form or another for the rest of your working life? Or are you saying to yourself, probably sometime in the next 10 years, I need an exit strategy to something more secure and more lucrative?
I'm taking night school economics courses.
Are you?
Just in case, yeah. For a while now, I've wondered what will happen if this thing blows up and I don't have a career in journalism. I like economics, so I take courses on the internet.
All right. So that's a present thing in your mind. This business I'm in might not be able to employ me. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yep.
Charlie? You're so reluctant.
I don't know. Yeah, no, I guess maybe I don't really think about it, and that's certainly pretty naive. I often turn to my dear father for career advice, and those calls tend to go pretty badly because he is a family physician, and as he tells me, he's been doing the same job for 30 years. And my mother, she was a phys ed teacher, and so both of them, very traditional careers that somebody who would be uncreative would be putting people in a badly written story where they're just trying to come up with the simplest careers possible. So neither of them are quite helpful with career advice and telling me what I should do next. They're lovely, great, but I don't know. I enjoy what I do. I enjoy what we do, and I don't really look too far ahead. I think within my lifetime, the expectations for what the world was going to be like and the opportunities that were going to be ahead of me have unfortunately not panned out, but that is much larger than just journalism. So, I like to think that the work that I do is good work, and I think that has been recognized, and right now it's working out. And if at some point it doesn't work out, like it almost didn't a couple of weeks ago, and I was certainly thinking about some other career prospects in the 24 hours that followed that fateful Wednesday, I think. But for the time being, it's a good gig, it's a fun gig, and I think it's an important one as well.
Great. I want to thank you both so much for your time today. Jessica, can you tell our listeners and viewers where they can find Trillium?
TheTrillium.ca.
TheTrillium.ca. Okay. Subscription package?
Right now, we're free and open until St. Patrick's Day. After that, stay tuned for the business model yet to come.
What is that, some sort of Irish thing?
I think it was just a convenient date.
I like to think it's an Irish thing.
All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank all of you Herle Burlyites who watched or listened today. And obviously, I'd like to thank Jessica and Charlie for their participation. We'll be back next week with more of the Herle Burly. Until then, take care of yourselves.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly.